Cranberry Halloween by Wendy and Harry Devlin. The New England October skies were bright and blue. Orange and yellow pumpkins lay in the fields, and the smell of cider was everywhere. "Halloween! Wonderful Halloween is coming!" said Maggie, throwing her hat in the air. Grandmother stopped stirring her cake. "Halloween is coming, but there will still be 2 weeks of hard work before it does. All the money for the new dock must be in on Halloween night, or it can't be finished by winter." A week ago, when the Cranberryport dock had been swept away by a wild storm, the townspeople had gathered in dismay at their town hall. What would Cranberryport be without a dock? Where would they tie their boats? Where would the children gather to fish and swim? Where would they all meet to picnic and watch sunsets? "We will build a new dock," said the mayor. "And we will help raise the money," said Grandmother. "Suffering codfish! I'll collect the money," said Mr. Whiskers. "I have my grandfather's money box." "Then you shall be treasurer, Mr. Whiskers," said the mayor. "And I'll guard your blinkin' money with my life," said the old clam digger, saluting proudly. But not everyone wanted Mr. Whiskers to be treasurer. Mr. Grape was not about to let his least favorite neighbor enjoy such an honor. "I object," said Mr. Grape. He banged his cane on the floor. "I double object. Mr. Whiskers doesn't pull his weeds, doesn't paint his house, and doesn't wash his windows. He'll lose your money." Grandmother stood and looked Mr. Grape in the eye. Mr. Whiskers would never let his friends down. The crowd quite agreed with Grandmother, and Mr. Grape left, shaking his cane angrily. The people of Cranberryport went home and began to plan how they would earn money. Everyone wanted to help. Grandmother and her friends would have pie and cake sales. Maggie would sell old books. Mr. Whiskers began to gather clams to make chowder to sell at the general store. One day, Mr. Whiskers walked up the long path to Mr. Grape's big brick house on the hill to ask for a donation. He waved to Mr. Grape's 2 red-headed gardeners and rang the front bell. Mr. Grape jumped in rage when he saw Mr. Whiskers. "Never! I'll give you no money for your dock, you whiskery humbug, and stay away from my house." Mr. Whiskers forgot all his good intentions. "Why, you old scoundrel, where's your town pride?" Mr. Grape slammed his door. Grumbling and growling, Mr. Whiskers made his way back over the cranberry bogs to his tiny gray cottage on the beach. The night of Halloween finally arrived, cold and moonlit. Tonight, all the money would be counted at town hall, and a wonderful party would follow with cider and donuts for all. Grandmother packed her basket with sugary donuts and went ahead to prepare for the party. Later, Mr. Whiskers stopped by to walk Maggie to town. Maggie wore a pink and green clown costume with a pointed clown's hat. Mr. Whiskers was dressed as a ghost. He tapped his money box proudly. "Almost full," he boasted to Maggie. They started for town. The rising winds and the pines and the screech of an owl were the only sounds in the blue night. A dark, empty house next to a bridge loomed against the sky. "Do we have to pass by that house tonight?" asked Maggie. "It's not so bad. I played in it when I was a boy," said Mr. Whiskers. "My old Aunt Prue lived there." Suddenly, Maggie whispered, "Stop! I hear someone behind us." Mr. Whiskers whirled around to see 2 burly men in pirate costumes almost upon them. "Hand over the money box," one of them hissed. "Mind your blinkin' manners," roared Mr. Whiskers. "Nobody takes my money box." He grabbed Maggie's hand and ran up the vine-tangled path to the deserted house. The dark of the night and heavy boots slowed the pursuing pirates. Running like the wind, Maggie and Mr. Whiskers fled to the front door. They pulled it open and squeezed in. Panting, Mr. Whiskers locked the door behind. "Run for the back door and lock it!" shouted Mr. Whiskers. Maggie felt her way through the darkened house, found the kitchen door, and bolted it. Just in time, for in the window she saw the fierce mask of one of the pirates. He pounded on the door and shouted, "Open up! We have you trapped!" Mr. Whiskers and Maggie, their hearts beating wildly, leaned against the kitchen wall and listened. The old house was filled with noises. Upstairs, the doors creaked. The wind moaned through the turrets, and the shutters banged. "I think I don't believe in ghosts," said Mr. Whiskers uneasily. "I think I don't either." "Good," said Mr. Whiskers. "Let's find a way out of here." Mr. Whiskers looked all around the kitchen. "Maggie, I remember something. We used to come in from the spring house by an underground passageway. Are you game to go down to the cellar?" Maggie thought of spiders, mice, and damp darkness, but with sudden spirit she said, "Let's go." Mr. Whiskers led the way. At the foot of the squeaking cellar stairs he struck a match. The dim light showed a rough, mossy door. Mr. Whiskers put his shoulder to the door and heaved mightily. An ancient bolt snapped, and the door swung away as mice scuttled and spiders scattered into the darkness. Mr. Whiskers fought his way through the cobwebs. Maggie followed, clutching Mr. Whiskers' sheet. Stumbling and groping through the underground passageway, they came, in time, to the spring house. At last, Mr. Whiskers and Maggie pushed their way into the clear night air. "Shh!" whispered Mr. Whiskers. "We could slip away behind these pine trees." Silently, they crept from the house, back to the road, and then off to town. At Town Hall, Grandmother worried and fussed. The mayor fumed, and the rest of the party became impatient at the absence of Mr. Whiskers and Maggie. The children had paraded around in their costumes. A feast of homemade donuts and pitchers of golden cider was placed on the tables. Everyone was anxious to eat. But where were Mr. Whiskers and Maggie? And where was Cranberry Port's money? Mr. Grape jumped to his feet. He looked very pleased. "You wouldn't listen to me. I told you Mr. Whiskers couldn't be trusted. You won't see that good good-for-nothing tonight." While Mr. Grape scolded the mayor and the crowd, a ghost and a small clown slipped into the midst of the party. After whispering to the sheriff, the ghost made his way through the crowd to Mr. Grape. In a sudden flurry, the ghost threw off his sheet, and there Mr. Whiskers stood, grinning in triumph. "Well, suffering codfish, I'm here, and so is my money box," said Mr. Whiskers. Mr. Grape gawped and gasped and fell back in his chair. "You have the money box?" he squeaked anxiously. Behind the crowd, the sheriff's voice boomed. He held two pirates in tow. "It's just as Mr. Whiskers said. These two rascals thought they had Mr. Whiskers and Maggie trapped in the old Peabody house." Mr. Whiskers stared at the unmasked pirates. "Why, they're Mr. Grape's gardeners," he said in amazement. "He's the one who made us do it," said the gardeners, pointing to Mr. Grape. Mr. Grape began to tiptoe toward the door when the sheriff's voice rang out. "Sit right here until I decide what to do with you, sir." Now the mayor, who had been counting the money for the new dock, rose to his feet and faced the crowd. "Bad news," he said. "There just isn't enough money for the new dock." The crowd groaned. Mr. Grape raised his hand. "Would you allow this public-spirited citizen to make up the difference?" He looked in the sheriff's direction with what he hoped was a winning smile. The sheriff turned to Mr. Whiskers. Well, it's up to you, sir. Mr. Whiskers took a bite of a donut, brushed the sugar from his brass button coat, and hummed a little tune. Slowly he smiled through his whiskers and said, For the folks of Cranberry Port, we might accept that blinking offer. The sheriff took his hand from Mr. Grape's shoulder and turned to the pirates. And you two had better tend to your gardening. Mr. Grape sighed with relief. The rest of the evening was a Halloween celebration. Cranberry Port would have a new dock, and everyone was delighted in bobbing for apples, singing, and drinking cider. You were a fine treasurer, said Grandmother as she watched Mr. Whiskers bob for apples. Yes, I'm a bloomin' wonder, said Mr. Whiskers. Maggie laughed. Grandmother shook her head. And Mr. Whiskers went down in the tub again for a final try for the apple. The end.